To stress that you do have to participate in some discussion session, and it's also wise to participate in some discussion session because the teaching assistants will be grading, except for the graduate students in my section. And therefore it's best to get to know them, what kind of scotch they like as a gift, whatever blandishments you're accustomed to showering upon the people who determine your fate. I was talking at the end of class on Tuesday about what appears to so many historians and archaeologists to be a kind of a paradox, that in the New World you have figurines with wheels, but you don't have any wheeled vehicles. To me, that is not in particular a paradox, but it seems to defy common sense. Now, there's one way to look at it that's purely technical, and that is to look at the experience that Galileo had when he was dealing with the question of, if you make a model of something, that it works, and then you scale it up. You have this beam, instead of being 6 inches long, you make it 6 feet long and so forth, then the whole thing falls apart. And he recognized, and this is partly from visits to the arsenal in Venice, that scale is something that is a matter of indifference to a geometer, but a matter of crucial importance to a person who is actually working with materials, because you have to calculate in stresses and strengths, and it's a very complicated task. If Archimedes, if he'd had a lever that was long enough, and a fulcrum, would have had a broken lever, because he's not going to move the world with a lever that long, unless it's made of, adamantium or some other well-known unbreakable metal. So with wheels, you have very much a technical issue. The wheel is held forth as the paradigmatic, self-evidently good invention. And to the point that the notion of reinventing the wheel is taken as a cliche for doing something that doesn't need to be done more than once. It's already been done, thank you. However, the question of the wheel is complicated. First of all, what was the first wheel like? Now here we have, we confront two types of evidence. One type of evidence comes from Mesopotamia, and it takes the form of basically that geometer's notion. They're little pictographs. So you have a little house, and then a pictograph that shows it on runners, on a sledge or a sled, and then a pictograph that shows that. And that is taken to be the earliest evidence for wheeled transport in Mesopotamia. Virtually simultaneous with that, according to carbon-14 dating, and there's a very different type of dating, because the Mesopotamian stuff tends to be hard numbers related to the reigns of kings whose reigns are known, whereas carbon-14 dating is based purely on a scientific calculation. But the earliest known actual wheels come from Denmark at almost exactly the same time as the ones in Iraq. And there's a long way between Denmark and Iraq. This has given rise to a sometimes heated argument among archaeologists as to where the wheel was invented. Was it invented in Northern Europe, or was it invented in the Middle East? If it was invented in the Middle East, it appears in a society that is a grain-growing agricultural society that already has cities, already has a fairly sophisticated technological toolkit, and has a writing system, because the same images that we see there are matched by other graphemes that are related to the origins of writing. And roughly it's around 3500 BC. I say roughly because your first evidence of something isn't necessarily terribly close to the beginning of something. The Danish wheels, the Northern European wheels, instead of having an image of them, we have the actual wheel preserved in peat bogs, essentially, that lack any oxygen that would have caused the organic material in the wheel to deteriorate. So what we have is a piece of wood, solid piece of wood. We have a hole in the center of the piece of wood, and if you look at the profile of the piece of wood, let's say there's the width of the wheel. It looks like that. In other words, the part that has the hole in it is drawn out on either side. If you have ever done something like trying to fix a weight to a lifting bar, one of the things you know is that if it will slide onto the bar, it will also wobble. And so you put on a sleeve that you tighten in order to hold it in place, or find some other way to hold it in place. Because the problem is that if you have enough leeway for the wheel to go onto a rod that is your axle, you're going to have a wobble factor. The way you defeat the wobble factor is by having the area through which the axle passes be very wide. Because the wider it gets, if you don't make it tighter, but by making it wider, it means that the leeway for wobble diminishes. So this area in here, part that sticks out, is known as the nave. The earliest wheels, that these 3,500 or 5,500-year-old wheels from 3,500 BC, were chipped out of solid wood with probably with stone implements. That's a lot of chipping, of course, depending upon the size. So part of the question is, what is the diameter of the wheel? And here you have one of these technical things of the sort that are not obvious from a model. That little, toy Jaguar with wheels on it in Mexico could not have gone on any surface other than something really flat. Because if you have a very small wheel, it doesn't take much of a barrier or a step or something to keep it from moving ahead. You need a flat surface. On the other hand, flat surfaces, road surfaces, let's say, require a great deal of effort to prepare. So if you're thinking about making a wheel, do you make a road first? Say, yeah, we're going to invent the wheel next week, but today we're going to make 7 miles of flat road. No, you don't. It has to be assumed that the first wheels went over uneven ground. And this necessitated a substantial diameter because it had to be able to roll over bumps. So the diameter is roughly 3 feet. Okay, now that, if it is out of a single piece of wood, it means that you have to have a tree that is at least 3 feet in diameter. Otherwise, how are you going to get something round out of a single piece of wood? Well, certainly Iraq didn't have any trees 3 feet in diameter. Iraq had scarcely any trees at all other than date palms, and date palms don't grow like other trees. They're actually more like stems, and they don't have the physical properties to be turned into wheels effectively. So, you wonder what they had in Iraq, but they probably didn't have 3 foot in diameter oak trees the way they would have had in Northern Europe. Now, you can simply take 3 planks and put them next to each other and fasten them with pegs and fish glue or something, and make something that will be 3 feet, that will sustain a 3 foot in diameter wheel. And we have later evidence of this, the so-called tripartite wheel. But the first ones were simply made out of solid wood. And if you think of that the original piece of wood had to be like that, you realize that somebody spent weeks chipping away wood in order to get to a wheel. This was enormously labor intensive to make that wheel. And when you got down to it, you did have a wheel, but you had a very heavy wheel. If you take the density of oak and you calculate the size of the wheel that you had, my calculation is that you must have had a wheel that weighed roughly 60 pounds. Now, 60. Now, if you have 4 wheels, we're talking about 240 pounds of wheel. And you add the weight of the axle, or of 2 axles if you have 4 wheels. Then you add the weight of the whatever it is that holds the whole thing together, the structure of the vehicle, and we're up to 300, 400 pounds of vehicle. Now the problem is that the power available from a pair of oxen is a fixed amount. It's a fixed power input. Oxen remain roughly the same strength from ancient times through medieval times down to early modern times. So you have a fixed power source, a pair of oxen, and you have the capability of those oxen carrying loads on their backs. And in certain parts of the world, pack cattle are terribly important. let's say, the entire economy of Tibet relates to a species of cow, namely the yak, carrying goods around on its back. Now you can cross a yak with a cow and you get a zo. So when you see masses of yaks in pictures from Tibet, you have to ask yourself, am I looking at yaks or at zos? And then you think you're in the middle of a Dr. Seuss book, and you know, it's the zos and the snows versus the yaks and the cracks or something. But you can actually tell. Supposedly there are two ways. I've never tried to check it out. One is that the tail of a yak is like the tail of a horse. It has long, silky strands, and therefore yak tails are used as fly whisks as a luxury consumption item in Indian history. But the tail of a zo is like the tail of a cow. It's a long rope with a little tuft at the end. On the other hand, the whole thing is covered with so much hair you can't really see the tail very much. The other thing is, and I just rely on informants for this, that yaks won't walk in a straight line. That yaks are like sheep. They like to be beside each other, to sort of bundle together. Whereas zos will line up and you can have them in a caravan. I'm not sure quite how they get yaks through Himalayan passes in bunches, but maybe they can. So you could have pack cattle. So the question is, how much can you carry on an ox versus how much can the ox pull? And of course, the wheeled vehicle increases what it can pull because you have something that's rolling. But on the other hand, the weight of the vehicle itself is so great. So it seems fairly clear that there was no economic use for the earliest wheels. That the effort to build it did not offer enough of an increment, if any, over the weight that could be carried by the same animals to make it an economically useful invention. Particularly when you take into account the fact that oxen carrying loads on their backs can pick their way over rough country. You don't have to worry about the surface. Whereas as soon as you have wheels, you have to worry about the surface. Now, the wheel evolves from this beginning, driven by a very clear technological demand to make it lighter, to make the wheel lighter and lighter and lighter. Now, for this most primitive type, there are two possible ways to make it lighter, both of which show up, although we don't have clearly fixed dates on them. One of them is to fix the wheel to the axle so it doesn't turn. In other words, you take two wheels, axle between them, and the whole unit turns. So then you don't worry about a wobble. You can nail the damn thing to the axle or fix it however way you can. It's a fixed unit. And you might think, well, I've never heard of that being done, although in children's toys it's done all the time. But in fact, if you go to Turkey today and look at surviving ox carts from the early 20th century, you'll find that one of the most common designs is to have the two wheels nailed to the axle, and then the whole unit turns instead of each wheel turning at the end of the axle. Now that reduces the weight because you don't have to have a nave. You can tell in a picture whether you were looking at a wheel that is fixed or a wheel that is rotating. You can tell by looking at this. If it is round, then the wheel is rotating. But if it is square, then the wheel is not rotating. So, you look at a picture of some ancient scene and you can tell. That was one way to do it, but it was not the preferred way to do it, it doesn't appear, because square holes do not show up all that often in early depictions. The other way to do it was to take the nave and make it a separate piece of wood. So then what you're doing is you're taking your big piece of wood and you're cutting a big hole in the center, and then you're inserting in that big hole a separate piece of wood. That's the nave that comes out on both sides. You can also, of course, then have different types of wood. You can have a harder wood, perhaps, for the nave, heavier wood, and a lighter wood for the wheel itself. And so we have specimens of inserted naves. Nevertheless, there's sort of a limit to how far you can go with that once you've tried that idea. So my mother was a physics professor, and she taught me that if you're at a blackboard and you want to draw a round circle and you're right-handed, draw it counterclockwise. If you do it clockwise, it won't look right. But if you draw it counterclockwise, it will be pretty round. So if you learn nothing else out of this course, someday when you're in a meeting making some sort of presentation, you'll put this impressive round circle on the on the whiteboard or wherever, and you'll think of me, and I'll be so proud. Now, the quest to make it. Let's say you have an inserted nave, so you have a large hole here. How do you make this lighter? Well, you get rid of the wood. After all, you need wood, at the axle, at the point where the axle goes through, and you need wood where the rubber hits the road, but you don't need all that wood in between. So people started to cut out chunks of wood, and they cut out chunks of wood. So they saved a lot of wood, and lo and behold, they had invented the spoke. Because once they discovered that you could lighten the wheel by cutting out the wood, then they thought, well, actually, you don't need one big piece of wood at all. All you need is the center part that contacts the axle, and an outer part that contacts the road surface, and you can simply use rods to connect the two. Technologically, this is an enormous advance. In manufacturing terms, it is a huge problem. Any farmer could make a solid-wheeled ox cart. If you look at the ox carts of Turkey in the early 20th century, they still had solid wheels. The spoke did not drive the heavier solid wheel out of existence, although they did start to taper the wheel. So the solid wheel would be smaller that side where it hits the road than it was in the center. So there's some improvements in the solid wheel, but basically the problem with the axle or with the spoke was that it was very, very difficult to do. It also raised a question of what is this outer rim? Does it mean you have to have a wooden hula hoop or something? Do you have to have a single hoop of wood, which could be complicated, particularly if it's a large diameter? And so he said, well, no, you can make this out of segments. So it's one segment, two segments. And then you could use pegs to fasten the segments together. And then you'd have a certain fixed number of spokes for each segment to help hold it in place. And these segments were called fellies. Why it's pronounced felly when it looks like it's fellow, I don't know. So the wheel came to be made of fellies, spokes, and nave, with an axle going through the center. Once you figured out how to do this, the number of spokes becomes a variable. So that in the earliest Chinese chariots, you're dealing with, say 45 spokes. You deal with Roman racing chariots, maybe dealing with 6 spokes. And part of that has to do with how many pieces, how many of the fellies there are, and with what is the overall diameter. If you are racing chariots, you want to have the lightest wheels, and the lightest wheels ultimately are still the ones with the smallest diameter. So chariot races used chariots with comparatively small wheels. Not that you ever see that in movies, where I must say the most primitive technologies are invented by movie designers that bear no relation to reality. So chariot racers might use small diameter wheels, as you see on Roman depictions, but a large diameter wheel meant a big guy, a powerful person. In other words, there was a prestige having to do with, my wheel is bigger than your wheel. It's a guy thing. There are, from Shang, China, which you've read about this week, there's 7 chariots that have been excavated from Shang period sites. And there, 2 of them had the wheels, and the others, the wheels had been dismounted and were somewhere else and were not found. But in the 2 where they had the wheels, the diameters were close to 5 feet. Close to 5 feet, about 57 inches. Those are big wheels. And there are other excavations in Central Asia that show wheels of comparable size and with zillions of spokes. And these show up in tombs. Because if you have a really, really fine ride, you want it to be buried with you. So chariot burials, for a period of several hundred years, become very important in the history of Eurasia, from northern China all the way across to Eastern Europe. We have several hundred chariot burials, sometimes with the skeletons of the horses there to show the horses were killed and put in the grave along with the chariot, sometimes with the chariot disassembled, sometimes with it intact. But all of these are identified by archaeologists as being very high status individuals. Later on, the Northern European version of this was to be burned in your boat if you were a Viking, or if you come to the Götterdämmerung section of Wagner's Ring Cycle, you get a nice Viking boat burning. But the suggestion here is that there was a very strong association of wheeled vehicles with prestige. Now, why would that be the case? Because after all, what you're starting with is something that's really clunky. We know that it had I was only talking about the weight of the wheel. But we know that there was very strong friction. Getting a 60-pound wheel to turn on a wooden axle, sure, you can put in bear grease or whatever, and we actually have one example of prehistoric wheels from Northern Europe that apparently used roller bearings. There were little grooves carved out where you could insert hardwood pegs to help the wheel turn. But by and large, you had a lot of friction, and those oxen had to overcome the friction, and they had to pull the weight. And the friction wasn't only the friction of turning on the axle, but it was the friction of the wheels against the ground. You don't always think of this, but the point of contact between the wheel and the ground is a very important source of friction. And it's the reason railroads are the cheapest form of wheeled transport, is because a hard steel wheel against a hard steel rail has unlike something else where the wheel is actually climbing up a little incline in order to start. There's no depression of the rail by the train wheel, and therefore you have a minimum of friction. I can give you references on that. Bicycle technicians have worked very aggressively on the issue of friction of bicycle wheels for competitive purposes. So you have friction. The reason you don't have wheelbarrows at the beginning is because the friction is too great. The muscle power it takes to operate one wheel is greater than a grown man can exert. That's the indicator of the role of friction here. Now, it's also important to realize that if you have four wheels, that is to say, if you have two axles and two wheels on each axle, if you have four wheels, you probably could have figured out how they'd be organized without my saying that. If you have four wheels, two axles, the friction is doubled. Now, you have a fixed power source. You have a pair of oxen, and you have a choice of having one axle that has a lot of friction, or two axles that will double the amount of friction. So the logical thing is that you have four wheels. The logical thing is that you have two wheels. Everyone in the world over time figured that out except the Europeans. Four images or actual manifestations, surviving remnants of four-wheeled vehicles show up in European situations from, let's say, from 3000 BC till today. The Europeans have this attachment to four wheels. They also use two wheels. It's by no means a single-minded thing, but they had four wheels and two wheels. No four-wheeled vehicles in China, no four-wheeled vehicles in India, no four-wheeled vehicles in most of the colonial lands unless it's a carriage for the viceroy. But in Europe, four-wheeled vehicles along with two-wheeled vehicles. And you think, here are the people who invented the wheel, which was a pretty stupid invention, and then they compounded it by using it in the stupidest form that anybody could think of. Why would they do that? What's the value added of having four wheels? And of course, when I ask people this, if I allow them to answer, they say, well, you can put more in it. Yes, you can. You can have a longer wagon bed. You can put more in it, but it doesn't make your oxen any stronger. Your oxen can pull a greater weight with a two-wheeled vehicle than they can pull with a four-wheeled vehicle. So having a bigger size it's an illusion that is a gain in efficiency. On the other hand, there are certain things that you don't want to tip over. And this, of course, is a problem with a two-wheeled vehicle, is that it can be tippy. What don't you want to turn over? You don't want the statue of the goddess to fall off the cart onto the ground. You don't want the great urn carrying the ashes of the king to fall off the cart and break on the ground. And you can make an argument, both in logical terms and in visual terms, from surviving images, that a substantial proportion of the four-wheeled vehicles were used in religious processions, where economic efficiency was utterly irrelevant, and also where the distance traveled was very short, and therefore you could make a smooth road surface. If you're just pulling the vehicle from the temple out to the public square and then back to the temple again, you can make that pretty smooth. Let's say in India, where the only vehicles used historically for thousands of years were two-wheeled vehicles, an exception was made for two things. One was made for images supposedly depicting warriors in the Great Bharata War. So later Indian images of chariots show someone in a chariot with four wheels, but that someone usually looks like a statue of a god. And the other thing is that you could actually take an entire temple and put it on wheels. And this is what is known as the juggernaut. In eastern India, there is a religious center where every year a huge temple-like structure is placed on wheels and it's pushed along a ceremonial way. And it's called a juggernaut in American usage of the term, which of course was immortalized in X-Men, The Last Stand. But the juggernaut was so heavy and so inexorable in its motion forward that if you slipped and fell, you would be crushed by the juggernaut, because the juggernaut would crush everything. Now, if you go now and look for images of the juggernaut online, one of the things you'll find out is that it has 18 wheels. Because how else are you going to carry something that's big and that much weight? And then you think, oh, it's an 18-wheeler. And you think, no, it's not. Because there are none of them are on the same axle. Instead, you have 18 individually suspended wheels put at various places underneath, and it's pushed by people. It's not pulled by animals. It's kind of neat. All right, so you can use your wheeled vehicle ceremonially. I think that in Iraq, what that is, that little bitty house that shows up in the ideogram, I think that that is a shrine. And that when you see sometimes a person in the house, that's a statue, and that the ceremonial function of wheels was a very important component in their development and in the press for continual improvement of the technology. Not able to prove that, but that is that's my suspicion. When you go to a slightly later time, medieval Europe, even early medieval Europe, in fact, going back to the late Roman Empire, and you collect images of four-wheeled vehicles, you find that those that are pulled by animals, because there are some that are being manhandled by teams of men, but those that are pulled by animals are passenger vehicles for multiple passengers. And the passengers are women. It's one of the most peculiar areas of gendered history. If you have a high status woman anywhere in the world, how do you move her from place to place? It is a big problem. If you have a chariot, of course, she can be there next to the chariot driver. But if you're her husband and you're not driving the chariot, and she goes off with that's not good. That can't be good. You can put her in a sedan chair and carry her, and this was done in certain societies. Indeed, the Emperor of Japan, down through the Meiji period in the 19th century, always traveled by sedan chair. Throughout Japan, he was just carried everywhere he went. So you can use a sedan chair, but then she's all alone. And so you have to have a bodyguard and so forth and so on. In some societies, she can ride a horse. Ultimately, in Central Asia, women ride horses. In Northwest Europe, women ride horses, side saddle, usually, because you have the costume difficulty. Or you have another choice, which is to leave the woman home. So that there's a correlation between societies that leave women at home, high status women, that seclude high status women, and societies that don't have the means to move them around in a fashion that will protect their personal safety and their modesty. When you read the history of Islam, you'll find that the question of modesty for the wife of Muhammad, who was traveling in a closed saddle on top of a camel that got separated from a caravan. It's one of the most crucial issues in Islamic history. A woman, a high status woman by herself is, if not in danger, is her husband can be victimized as and shamed by the whole thing. So the solution, if you have a four-wheel vehicle, is to have a whole party of women moving. The princess and her ladies-in-waiting, and they move together. We have many, many depictions of this, and they're all from Europe, and almost all from Eastern Europe. Many of them from the Ottoman period, where parties of women would go on picnics outside of Istanbul, but you have them from other parts of Europe as well. Now, this is important because in Eastern Europe, you have the invention of the carriage, of the coach, rather. Coach is a Hungarian word, and it appears that is where the coach originated. What is a coach? You're familiar, I would imagine, with the design of a modern automobile where you have a chassis and a body. The chassis consists of the basic frame, the motor, the wheels, the transmission system, all the guts of the automobile, and then on top of it you place the body, which is separately manufactured, and it can be interchangeable. You can have the same chassis for a Pontiac or an Oldsmobile or a Cadillac or something like that, and you just change the body. Well, that was one of the aspects of a coach, was that the body was separated from the chassis. Why did that happen? It was because of the invention of suspension. You could have when suspension is invented, let's say the earliest forms, you have a four-wheeled vehicle with verticals at either end, a hook on the verticals, and a hammock slung from the hooks. We actually have both a description from in Arabic, but written in Arabic by an ambassador from Spain that describes this in precise detail, and we have a medieval miniature showing a vehicle exactly like this, where somebody is riding in a hammock suspended from hooks. The coach took this notion of suspension and they said, well, let's take leather straps or chains and suspend them from the hooks. And then we'll take a body and lower it on top, so it can sway and you don't get troubled by the bounces. Well, warriors don't worry about being troubled by the bounces, but the princess, with her delicate sensibility and her ladies-in-waiting, they want a better ride. So I think that the development of suspension is related to the transport of high-status women in Eastern Europe in wheeled vehicles. There are other aspects of this that I will get to in a later lecture on Europe, but I just want to point out that it's only in Europe that you get this obsession with the four-wheeled vehicle. You get the invention of suspension, you get the invention of steering, which I'm not going to go into right now, you get the invention of brakes, all of which arise with four-wheeled vehicles. And what you end up with is that in the steam era, the only part of the world that has the technological expertise to have power-driven wheeled transport is Europe. That's where the trains and the cars and so forth originate, because they've already solved the problems of brakes and steering, suspension, four wheels, so forth and so on. You take away your team of oxen and you replace it with an onboard steam or later internal combustion engine, and now you have a modern vehicle. Now, in certain audiences, if I talk about this, there will be a sort of a reflex to say, oh, that's because the Europeans had a superior grasp of science and technology. But as I'm trying to point out, this was the result of stupidity. This is something that inadvertently and with no foresight at all happened to supply Europe with the capacity other parts of the world didn't have, because Europe, in its first 3,000 years of vehicle use, stuck to a really bad design. Okay, now let's take this notion of a really bad design and go somewhere with it. I kept talking about a team of oxen, 2 oxen. Of course, you can put 2 more in front of them and say it's 4 oxen, but your basic team is a pair of animals. And what hooks them together is a yoke. In Latin, a jugum. One of the most pregnant words in Indo-European languages, because it refers to hooking 2 things together, so that a man and a woman are hooked together in a conjugal bond. The J-U-G in there means they're yoked together. When you have animals, particularly oxen and horses, they were counted in ancient Indo-European languages by the yoke. I have so many yoke of oxen, so many yoke of horses. For property, a jugum came to be regarded as an area of land, the area of land that could be plowed in a single day by a yoke of 2 oxen. It's a word, the notion of yoking 2 things together is, pervades the culture. It has been related, and here, let me just mention a rather speculative theory. Anyone who wants to follow it up, there's an Italian writer named Ugo Bianchi. Wrote a book called Il Dualismo. Very interesting. Unfortunately, it's in Italian. His theory is that the absorption with the number 2 arises from a conception, basically a cosmological conception, that unity is 2. I haven't talked about this in this class, have I? No. I was talking about somebody about this recently. That unity is 2. His most concrete example comes from the languages of Indonesia and Malaysia and related Austronesian languages. And what he observes, and which you learn very readily if you take Bahasa Melayu or Bahasa Indonesia, is that the word for 1 is literally 1/2. Setangga. 2 is unity. That is the complete thing. But 1 is 1/2. The way this comes into English is that Setangga becomes the name of a cocktail called a stinger. Setangga, stinger, stingar, whatever, and which is what, half gin and half something else. The Brits probably it'd be like half gin, half whiskey or something, I don't know. But he said that the idea of unity being 2 instead of 1 fits in with a cosmological concept of dualism, in which you have light and dark, good and evil, male and female, yin and yang, that everything has a complement, that you simply don't have completion unless you have the 2 parts of the complement. And he argues that this goes back to Paleolithic times, and that you can find it throughout Eurasia and North and South America, the notion of unity being 2. In the Indo-European languages, the ones that are spoken from northern India across Iran and Europe, this has been studied with less of a focus on cosmology, but just mostly on linguistics, by a Dutch Sanskritist named Jan Gonda, who has a short but quite fascinating book called The Numerals 1 and 2 in Proto-Indo-European. And he raises this question of, do the words in the Indo-European languages, like English or Hindi or Persian or Russian, do the words originally, the words 1 and 2, mean 1/2 and whole? And by looking at scores of different words like twin and double and things like that, he concludes that there's a very early linguistic stratum that does indeed indicate that the Indo-European languages, or the Proto-Indo-European language from which they all derive, had this conception of unity being 2 and 1 being 1/2. So in the cosmogonic myth of the earliest Indo-Europeans, you have the notion of the first person, whose name is usually Manu, and his twin, whose name is Yima. And Yima is sacrificed, and the world is made out of his body. But the word, Yima is there as twin. This shows up in Roman history as Romulus and Remus, because Remus can be traced back phonologically to being a Latin variant or Latin development of the word Yima for twin. In Norse mythology, you have the giant Ymir, and the world is made out of him. So this is the argument that the notion of completion being 2 is built into the earliest stratum. Now, whether you go with Bianchi and you say this stretches all the way from Ireland to the Tierra del Fuego, across Eurasia and throughout the Americas, or whether you take the more restricted view of Gonda and you look at the earliest Indo-European languages and you use the connection with Indonesian only as a distant comparison rather than part of the same phenomenon, it doesn't take away from the notion that doubleness, 2-ness, can have a very powerful force. Now, if you go into East Asian culture, everyone recognizes this. Yin-yang is, commonplace. If you get into Western cultures or Semitic cultures, although I'd point out that Cain and Abel make a very nice pairing in this. But if you get into these Western cultures, it's less evident. But one place where it becomes evident is in the insistence on yoking 2 animals to a vehicle. Before anyone ever thought to hook up a horse to a chariot, and to say when wheeled vehicles were still pulled by oxen, the people who were most associated with early evidence for the use and training of horses and of using chariots, and these are the Hittites who lived in central Turkey and who produced the first text we have on the training and use of horses and chariots. Their storm god traveled in a chariot drawn by oxen, not by horses. And it's very clear that the association between a wheeled vehicle drawn by 2 animals and a god was prior to the invention of the war chariot or the development of the notion of the horse-drawn vehicle. And in fact, throughout the Indo-European cultures, not the Semitic, you find lots of evidence of the gods riding in chariots. So the sun is seen as a chariot that travels through the heavens, driven, pulled by the horses of Phoebus Apollo. The animals that pull the chariots are not always cattle and not always horses. For example, they can be geese. Because, after all, if you're going to pull a chariot through the heavens, it would be useful to know how to fly. The early word for goose that survives in German is Hanse. And so when you fly in Lufthansa in the air goose, you're kind of getting a little flavor of this old notion of the chariot pulled by geese through the sky. Maybe. There's another meaning for Hanse as well, but I'm not going to give you that one. So you had different gods. Thor's chariot is pulled by goats. There is a famous chariot race at a wedding in early Indian mythology, in which all the gods have a chariot race, and each one is in a chariot drawn by a different animal. And which animal wins the race? It's the chariot drawn by donkeys. And then they say it exhausted the donkeys so much that even though they won the race, from then on they were weak and humble animals. But that preserves a much earlier notion of the donkey as a sacred animal in and of itself. I have just finished writing a novel called The One Donkey Solution that is based entirely on the mythology of sacred donkeys and how that might relate to Israel-Palestine negotiations or the threat posed to Israel by the Iranians. And it is an absolutely absurd novel, but if anybody wants it on a PDF file, just email me and let me know, and you can read The One Donkey Solution. I doubt anyone's ever going to publish it. It insults everybody. But I felt that when Ahmadinejad came here and I helped facilitate setting up his talk at Columbia, I played a role in making him kind of an international star. Now I'd like to play a role in humiliating him on an international basis. But probably not going to happen. But I know so much about donkeys. I just can't begin. I wish I could. I've been doing it for the last year, just working on donkey stories. Anyway, not to digress. The association of the yoked animals with the chariot, with the gods, carries over into the role that the horse chariot plays in the social structure of the society that finally develops it, namely Central Asian society, where it becomes a war vehicle. Indo-European society at that time had two castes of people who were sort of co-equal. It had the Brahmins, who were the priests, and it had the Kshatriyas, who were the warriors. The king was always a Kshatriya. There are two other castes below them, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. but they're much below them in the original form. It's really the priests and the warriors who are at the top of society. The warriors ride in chariots, and it becomes the mark of their class because they are like gods. So you have this strong association of riding in a war chariot that makes you a sort of semi-divine warrior figure. So now think about the Iliad. There you have Patroclus has been killed. There are funeral games, so-called, in his honor. And the culminating one is the chariot race. And this is, these were not games. These were very, very sacred things. And the notion of the chariot race being a sacred ceremony carries on for hundreds of years in the hippodrome in Istanbul and hippodromes elsewhere. The emperor and the religious elite would attend the chariot races. I am absolutely certain that that NASCAR is the contemporary expression of this Indo-European obsession with racing vehicles. It's another book that won't get published now. So when you have chariots that are buried in high status graves, and even when they're buried in Shang, China, where there is, that starts around 1750 BC, the Shang dynasty in China, as you know because you read the chapter so carefully. There's very little evidence at that time that the chariots were really used for warfare. They were status markers. And they're status markers pretty much all the way through. There is a great question as to whether chariots were ever very effective in the battlefield, except against other chariots. Because, if the battlefield is bumpy, the chariot might turn over. You have one chariot driver, one warrior, 2 horses, and a vehicle. 5 combat entities. If any one of them goes down, the whole unit goes down. Whereas if you put one man on a horse, you have 2 combat entities, and you've more than doubled your combat effectiveness. The Roman strategic writer Vegetius explicitly in his chapter on chariots talks about what a dumb thing it would be to have chariots, because they depend upon level terrain and they're just not very efficient. And over time, every country that adopted the war chariot abandoned the war chariot fairly early, the people in Central Asia being the first to abandon it and move to cavalry. However, the symbolic role of the war chariot continued, so that the Romans did not have chariots, but according to Livy, when the Roman king, back in the very early times, when the Romans had, the kings, I guess it's the early republic. Anyway, when you had a consul who won a victory, he would be granted a triumph. A triumph was a ceremony in which the successful general would march through Rome with his army and with his captives and with his booty, and it would be a great public display. But the general, the victorious general, was the only person who rode on a chariot. And he was painted vermilion from head to toe, because that was the color of the statue of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. And he would be going along, carried on a chariot as a god. And running along beside him, there would be a slave who supposedly would keep looking up and saying, "Remember, thou art not a god. Remember, thou art not a god." So the association of wheeled vehicles and gods is close, even to the extent that if you had a ruling family that had a claim to be divine, they might not be permitted to ride on a horse. The Merovingians, who ruled France after the fall of the Roman Empire, had to, they were divine lineage of kings. They weren't allowed to shave their beards, and they had to ride on wheeled vehicles. I figure France has about, 5 trees per, per 5 feet, so that presumably most of the Merovingian army spent most of its time cutting down trees so the king could get through on his wheeled vehicle. But it's this association of the wheeled vehicle, and this plays into the notion of these high status women, and at a later point after the invention of the coach, of European monarchs riding in carriages instead of riding on horseback. This extends into China, first under the Shang, and then war chariots come along later. And it's one of the examples of the diffusion of practices across very broad distances, because this is a case where you can pretty clearly show that it was borrowed from peoples who are much further west in Central Asia. But the fact that you had the wheels of the Shang dynasty royal chariots being 5 feet in diameter sort of indicates the degree to which these were more signs of a quasi-divine status than simply means of transportation or even means of war. And this relates to something else I wanted to talk about, but I'll get into it more next week, and that is the beginning of writing. Because in China, the earliest writing that we have that's verified, I stress that because there are theories that say that Neolithic pottery has potter's marks on it that are sort of proto-Chinese writing. But the earliest Chinese writing that is verified and where words can be identified and translated and so on, comes from the Shang period, from 1750 BC onward until about 1200 BC. It doesn't come from the entire period, but from a period of about 200 or 300 years. And it takes the form of what are called oracle bones, which are described in your chapter in some detail. But the main thing is that the divination used in the oracle bones had to be done by the emperor, by the king. Because, if you can't be an oracle, be a prophet, be a seer without certain attributes. And the attribute for the Shang ruler was that he was the emperor, so that he couldn't assign it to the court minister of cracking turtle shells. It had to be him. In the same way that in a Semitic tradition, only certain people could be priests. Only certain people could be prophets. Only someone descended from David can be can be the Messiah. And this is something that you get in other parts of the world. It's just that usually the attributes are by lineage or learning or something that's sort of high cultural. But in the case of the chariots, it really is a technological attribute that imparts to the Kshatriyas this spiritual the spiritual force. The Brahmins do not ride in chariots, and in a sacrifice, the Kshatriya provides the animal, but the Brahmin is the one who performs the sacrifice. And I've written about that in the part that's been assigned to you from my book on animals. But I'm going to talk more about writing next week, and I'm also going to give you some readings for next week of a cosmogonic character. How did the universe come into being in the conception of some different peoples? And I'll put up some sort of thought questions on CourseWorks as well. You'll hear about that through CourseWorks.